Welcome to our lecture on auditory perception. In the first part of this lecture, we'll identify several of the basic physical properties of sound. In the second part, we'll turn our attention to the psychological correlates of those basic dimensions, that is, what are the perceptual dimensions of sound. In the third part, we'll look at the question of how sound waves, that is, the mechanical energy present in the environment that we perceive as being sound, how that information, that mechanical information, is converted into neural energy. And in the fourth part, we'll look at what's known as auditory localization. That is, the computations that are involved in the brain working out where a given sound is coming from. The auditory system is sensitive to variations in environmental pressure. For humans, our experience of sound is generally informed by variations in air pressure. These pressure changes are known as sound waves. Sound waves are caused by perturbations or movements in the environment. This diagram shows a travelling pressure wave caused by movement or perturbation of the red line at the far left. Here, the black circles represent the environmental medium, air particles, for example. When the red line moves from left to right, you can see that the air particles undergo compression. That is, the air particles closest to it undergo compression. And that this compression moves across space from left to right. This is a pressure wave. The speed at which pressure waves or sound waves travel depends on the density of the medium through which it travels. In air, at room temperature, sound travels at about 330 meters per second. In water, which is much more dense, it travels at about 1,380 meters per second. And in bone, which is more dense again, it travels at over 2,800 meters per second. Whilst this diagram shows sound in one dimension, in the real world, sounds travel in 3 dimensions as approximately spherical waves. Here I'm showing you an intermediary stage between 1 and 3 dimensions, that is 2 dimensions, whereby we're representing a sound emanating from the center of the diagram and propagating outward in 2 dimensions, just like the ripples on a pond. Sound waves are functionally transparent. That is to say, when 2 sound waves meet, such as in this diagram showing 2 different waveforms, moving in opposite directions, at the point at which they do collide, the pressure associated with each simply sums together at that point. This is known as superposition. Importantly, however, the waves and the energy associated with each wave will continue to simply pass through the other. The waves themselves do not interact, they simply sum together. And because they simply sum together and then pass through each other, we say that they're functionally transparent. Here I'm showing you a horizontal view of a pressure wave. The x-axis here is physical distance in 1 dimension, and the y-axis is pressure. The height of the pressure wave, measured by its peak to its trough, is known as amplitude. This is a measure of pressure intensity. As you can see, this pressure wave has a single peak and a single trough. The distance covered by an entire period of this pressure variation is known as the wavelength, which is 2 times the distance between the peak and the trough. A waveform with this kind of periodic structure is known as a sinusoidal or pure waveform. The wavelength of this sinusoidal or pure waveform is inversely proportional to the wave's frequency. At shorter wavelengths, its frequency increases. All sound waves, no matter how complex, can be decomposed mathematically into pure or sinusoidal waveform components of variable frequency, amplitude, and phase. That all sounds can be deconstructed into these simpler waveform components was originally discovered and mathematically formalized by Joseph Fourier in the 18th century. This is known as Fourier analysis. We've talked about various physical properties of sound, including amplitude, frequency, and complexity. It turns out that these and some other physical properties have perceptual correlates. For example, amplitude has a perceptual correlate of loudness, that is, how soft or loud a sound is. A soft sound will be like this, whereas a loud sound will be like this. These are correlated with differences in amplitude, but we call them differences in perceptual loudness. Frequency, on the other hand, that is the physical property relating to which is inversely proportional to the wavelength of the waveform, has a physiological correlate which we refer to as pitch. Something with a low frequency has a low pitch, whereas something with a high frequency is perceived as having a high pitch. So that variation from low, that sweep from low to high frequencies also is correlated with a variation from low pitch to high pitch. Another aspect of sound, which has both physical and perceptual correlates, is complexity. So we talked about complexity a little while ago in our discussion of Fourier analysis. Now, why this is important is it provides us with information not about what is being said or what is being played, but what is making the sound. That is to say, it enables us to actually identify the object making the sound. So two singers, for example, singing the same melody and the same lyrics will sound different to each other because of the overtone structure and the complexity of their different voices. The complexity of the different voices, known as timbre, T-I-M-B-R-E, timbre, gives us information about what or who is making the sound. Similarly, two instruments playing exactly the same melody can be differentiated from each other by their timbral characteristics. So timbre is the perceptual information we use to differentiate between different auditory objects. Another aspect of sound that has both physical and perceptual correlates is position. And the position of a sound, which is physically speaking where the sound is coming from, enables us to work out, perceptually speaking, where the sound is coming from, as opposed to what the sound is. So we can extract position, that is, work out where a sound is coming from as well. Finally, we have information about the content, that is, not who or what is making the sound or where it is coming from, but what is actually being said or played. So two different melodies, for example, have different informational content. Two sentences have different informational content. This is about what is actually being said or played. We talked earlier about the frequency characteristics of sound. Well, it turns out that the human auditory system isn't equally sensitive to all frequencies. So in this graph, I'm showing you on the x-axis, we have frequency of the sound, of a given sound. Now, on the y-axis, we've got how much intensity is in a given sound. Now, I'd like you to pay attention to the green curve, which we're which we've labelled here as being the threshold of hearing. Now, what this threshold means or refers to is how much intensity, physical intensity, that is how much amplitude is required in order for the person to actually hear the sound. And as you can see, it's not horizontal. In other words, the human auditory system isn't equally sensitive to all frequencies. It varies across frequency. In fact, you can see that we're less sensitive, that is, thresholds are higher at the very low frequencies. So at near 20 hertz, we've got quite poor sensitivity. And as we increase the frequency, we get maximum sensitivity of between about 1,000 hertz, that is 1 kilohertz, up to about just under 10,000 kilohertz. That's where we tend to get the peak in sensitivity. That is where the green curve is lowest here. Now, if we pay attention to the red curve, that's our threshold for pain, and that's how much intensity is required for us to actually experience pain. And you'll notice that it's fairly horizontal until we get to this point around here at about 5,000 hertz or 5 kilohertz. Turns out that that is the frequency at which babies cry, so that's probably why we're most sensitive, and it's actually a painful sound, so we have to do something about it and stop the baby from crying, probably by feeding it or doing something to assist in its survival. Also plotted here are the frequency and amplitude characteristics of speech and music. Now, these speech and music fall above the thresholds of our hearing, obviously, because we can hear them. But as you can see, the speech falls between about 200 hertz and about 8 kilohertz. So that's the frequency range of normal speech. And surrounding that, we've got music. So music can be louder or softer than speech, but it also has lower and higher frequencies than normal speech, although it is centered on speech. And so consequently, you can get serious sub-bass sounds down on the far left, or very high sibilants, such as the sound of cymbals at the far right. Now, looking back at the green curve, at our threshold for hearing, remember that the peak of this threshold was around 200 hertz to around, about 8,000 hertz. And that peak in our sensitivity happens to correspond to the frequency characteristics of normal speech. So it's as though the human auditory system is optimized, or the sensitivity of it at least, is optimized to the frequency characteristics of speech. Let's now turn our attention to the transduction of physical sound information, that is pressure waves, air pressure waves generally, into neural energy. How does this process actually occur? Well, in the case of the auditory system, it's a very convoluted process. There are multiple stages to it. A sound will travel in approximately one dimension, as we've seen before. First of all, it interacts with the outer layer of the auditory system, which is the pinnae, which is this little flappy thing on the side of your head. You've got one on each side of your head. So that funnels the sound down the auditory canal. The very first structure it interacts with is the tympanic membrane, also known as the eardrum. Now, this tympanic membrane will actually oscillate in sympathy with the pressure waves which arrive at it. So it'll actually set up a vibration with the same frequency structure as the sound wave that's actually interacting with it. Now that then sets up movement via lever action, in fact, in 3 different bones: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, collectively known as the ossicles. This malleus, incus, and stapes have the function of amplifying the signal. So here we have the waveform which is interacted with the pinnae. It's funneled in through the auditory canal, interacted with the tympanic membrane, set up movement via lever action in the malleus, incus and stapes, and then that produces a knocking, if you like, upon a structure known as the oval window. The oval window is the gateway to the sensory structure known as the cochlea. The cochlea is a fluid-filled tube that houses the neural receptors of our auditory system. These are known as cilia or hair cells. These cilia are located along the length of an elastic membrane known as the basilar membrane. This elastic membrane structure can be thought of as analogous to the retina, although it's arranged in one spatial dimension rather than two. When the malleus, incus and stapes resonate in sympathy with the sound wave, this then sets up a resonance within the cochlea. Because the basilar membrane is very flexible, the particular frequency or frequencies present in the cochlea causes the basilar membrane to become displaced. The particular location of this displacement along the basilar membrane is frequency specific. Low frequencies cause displacements in the basilar membrane further away from the oval window and closer to the basilar membrane's tip or apex. Higher frequency sounds cause displacements in the basilar membrane closer to its base, which is closer to the oval window. The hair cells, arranged along the basilar membrane, are sensitive to perturbations along the basilar membrane. When a certain section of the basilar membrane becomes displaced, the cilia at that location undergo an action potential. This is the transduction from mechanical to neural energy that is responsible for our hearing. These signals then leave the cochlea via the auditory nerve. They then synapse at numerous locations, including the brainstem, medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, before eventually synapsing in the primary auditory cortex. The front or anterior section of the primary auditory cortex contains neurons sensitive to lower frequencies than the posterior region. For this reason, the primary auditory cortex is said to have a tonotopic map of frequency space. This is analogous to the retinotopic mapping seen in primary visual cortex, whereby adjacent neurons in the retina drive adjacent neurons in primary visual cortex. Here we have adjacent neurons in the basilar membrane driving adjacent neurons in the primary auditory cortex. We're now going to move to the fourth part of this lecture. That's localization. And this is the question of where is the sound coming from? What are the computations that the auditory system uses to distinguish between where and identify where a sound is coming from? Now, what cues do we use? Well, it turns out we use multiple cues, depending on how much information we have available to us. The primary cues we use for localization are binaural cues. Binaural cues refer to the fact that rely on the fact that we have two different ears in our head. The binaural cues are known as interaural time differences and interaural intensity differences. Interaural time differences refer to the fact that sound, because sound travels fairly slowly, about 330 meters per second in air, that it takes time for a sound to travel from one side of the head to the other. We actually have exquisite sensitivity to this, which gives us information about which direction the sound is coming from. Interaural level differences are similar, except they're not based on differences in the time of arrival between the two ears, but instead differences in the amplitude between the two ears. So if a sound is coming from your right side, so if you click your fingers just immediately adjacent to your right ear, that sound will be louder in your right ear than your left ear. So that's an interaural level difference. But it will also arrive at your right ear before your left ear. That's an interaural time difference. Now, what many of you may have realized is because interaural time and intensity differences are based on the fact that we have two ears in our heads that are horizontally oriented, that this is useful for information that varies in the horizontal plane. And the horizontal plane is known as the azimuth. So if you were to stand and raise your hand in front of you and then spin around, your hand will be moving in the azimuth, the horizontal plane. For sounds in the elevation plane, that is in the up-down plane, we have to use different kinds of information. Another problem that arises from binaural cues is intrinsic ambiguity. So I want you to think about which locations around your head would you expect to find identical interaural time differences and identical interaural level differences. Well, let's imagine you click your fingers immediately in front of you. Well, presumably it's immediately in front of you. The sound will arrive at your two ears at the same time with approximately the same amplitude. Where else around your head do you get the same result? If you were to answer immediately behind you, you'd be right. Immediately behind your head is where the sounds emanating from that location would arrive at the two ears at the same time, at the same level. So the binaural cues immediately in front and behind you. Also ambiguous are the positions, say, plus or minus 45 degrees from you. So if you've got a sound coming immediately from your right, the interaural time difference associated with a sound that's 10 degrees in front of that will be identical to the interaural time differences that were 10 degrees behind. This is known as the cone of confusion, and it's a cone because it happens in both x and y dimensions, in both the azimuth and the elevation plane. So how do we get around this ambiguity, and can we? Well, the answer is yes, we can. And the way we resolve this intrinsic ambiguity is to use a different kind of cue altogether. The most important of these are what are known as monaural or spectral cues. These are called monaural cues because they're actually derivable using a single ear. That each ear in isolation can do this. So it turns out that our ears themselves, that is the pinnae, the little flap of skin on the outside of your ear, actually has a purpose. And that purpose is to filter the sound. So depending on where a sound comes from, you'll get a different kind of filtering. That is, certain frequencies will be attenuated depending on where the sound comes from. And that's a consequence of the filtering that occurs in your ear. So your ear itself is a filter that provides us with information about space. So over time, you learn that a sound above your head and a sound below your head, which produce different sounds, are associated with things above and below you. The specific shape and textural characteristics of your pinnae, of your specific pinnae, are specific to you, and they give you a map of space that characteristically attenuates certain frequencies and not others, depending on where the sound is coming from in space. So if you were to remove your own pinnae and put someone else's on, you would have to relearn where sounds were coming from. And over time, you would be able to do it. For completeness, I just want to mention briefly the final type of localization cue that we use to establish where sounds are coming from. and also how far away the sounds are. These are reverberation cues. So essentially these are cues which arise by virtue of the fact that sounds actually reflect off solid surfaces. A sound that's coming in the far distance, then you will tend to hear the reflections much closer in time after you hear the initial sound from that object than if the object were much closer to you. If the object is much closer to you, you'll hear the sound before you hear the reverberation from the environment. So we get information about how far away sound is from the amount of time between the initial sound and the reverberation.